It's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Lisa Williams to our humble room. And Lisa's got her PhD in 2009 from Northeastern and has come and been working at UNSW ever since. And I guess she must really like Australia. She's a social psychologist, but she knows a lot of cool stats too, so she'll be able to talk about that. Her major focus is really constant with what we do is positive emotion. We're doing a grant together with couples, but she also does something that's dear to many of our hearts, which is prosocial behavior, which she's going to talk about now. How do you motivate people to engage in more prosocial behavior? She does really cool, not just field work, but also lab-based work, and she's got this wonderful setup at UNSW where you can look at how people interact from moment to moment and kind of get all kinds of things like gaze and facial expressions and things like that. And this morning she did a TV interview, so she's a bit of a
Feeling
star.
very on the spot today. Thank you, Joseph, and thank you for coming. I consider this a privilege to be able to share some of my research with you. I will say before I even start some of the content that I'm going to be presenting some brand new research and some brand new analyses. So I'm really happy to hear your thoughts on kind of how I've been treating the data that I've collected. As Joseph mentioned, it spans a lot of paradigms: experimental, field research, experience sampling, and things like that. So to set the stage, most people would be well familiar with the classic differentiation between positive and negative mood, positive and negative affect, and how positive affect is generally considered to be beneficial. Long enduring periods of negative affect are a core aspect of many mental illnesses. And a lot of research has focused indeed on how to promote positive affect. My own interest actually takes a much more discrete view. So here we have classic portrayals of the 6 so-called basic emotions, and one thing that stands out as someone who's interested in positive emotion is that amongst the basic emotions there's only one, and that's happiness. But it should be no surprise that positive emotion takes a lot more varieties than simply generalized positive mood or even happiness. And really this is the focus of my research. So in particular, I use a discrete emotions approach. That is, I look at emotions that are differentiated from one another on any number of dimensions and look at how those function for us. So I use an evolutionarily based approach that argues that the reason why we have differentiated emotions is at least in part because they help us navigate our environment. Now, our evolutionary environment, perhaps at first, was largely characterized by challenges to our survival, challenges to reproduction, and perhaps that would be the case, or one reason why basic emotions have received so much research focus. That is, looking at how disgust helps us avoid noxious substances, how anger helps us deal with goal blockages, would be of interest because those types of functions are core to survival. But over evolutionary history, it becomes clear that for human adaptive life, we need to look at more than just avoiding predators and not dying and reproducing. We actually need to navigate our social relations effectively. So beyond just looking at discrete positive emotions, my research really focuses on discrete positive socially oriented emotions. So these are a subset of emotions that were thought to come about due to this evolutionary pressure to get along with others. So to give a bit of weight to this, we can look to Harrelly and Parkinson, 2 emotion researchers who are key in this field. They wrote that all emotions are seen as incorporating social elements, but it is only social emotions whose identity is specified by these social elements. Now, it's kind of a fancy way of saying that all emotions can be social, right? So we can feel disgust towards another person, we can feel anger towards another person, but social emotions actually require another person, at least in an imagined sense, certainly in a real physical sense. So today I'm going to be talking about some research that has adopted focus either solely or on all 3 of these emotions. So gratitude is classically defined as a positive, socially oriented emotion that arises when you've received some sort of benefit or favor from another individual. Its argued function is to help us build social relationships, to encourage reciprocity. Compassion, another positive socially oriented emotion, specifically arises upon witnessing the suffering of others. And the argued function of compassion is to motivate prosocial helping to alleviate that suffering. And the third emotion that I'll be talking about in some detail today is pride. Pride is an interesting case of a socially oriented emotion because it is fundamentally self-pointed. So we typically feel pride when we experience a success. And the social nature of pride really comes out when we look at what behaviors pride makes us do. And this is some of the earliest work I did, showing that pride actually helps us pursue goals that are socially valued. It helps us take on leadership roles. That at the end of the day, the reason why we feel proud when we achieve a success is to help us climb the social ladder effectively. So today I'm going to talk about the research that I've done considering these three emotions and how they tie into this broad kind of psychosocial benefit framework. And to do this, I've divided up the talk and quite literally have drawn a roadmap for you. I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I have done on these three emotions and personal well-being. Then I'm going to turn to social well-being, and by this I mean the types of outcomes that really help us foster and build social relations with others. I'll be talking about 3 studies on gratitude and 2 on pride. And then I'm going to turn to a broader sense of well-being or psychosocial benefit and talking about some of the work I've done on volunteering and blood donation. Before continuing or jumping into these studies, I do want to point out one thing, especially in this social well-being section, is that emotions have multiple forms. So we can consider what happens when an individual feels an emotion, and that's the framing I took just a moment ago when I introduced you to these common definitions. What does person X do when they're feeling emotion Y? But emotions are also communicative. So classically, the smile conveys happiness, the furrowed brow conveys anger. When we turn to these more socially oriented emotions, the expressions are slightly less clear as to what is the exact signal, but they're no less important. So some of those studies I'll be talking about are not only how an emotion affects well-being when it's felt, but also when it's expressed. Okay, so let's jump in. The first study I want to talk about today has been led by my PhD student, Elizabeth Barrett Cheatham. And she adopted this focus. She came to me and she really wanted to do research on well-being, and she knew that I use this differentiated positive emotional approach in my work. And she came up with this idea that just like there are varieties of positive emotion, there are also varieties of well-being. And she developed this theoretical model that mapped these 3 emotions onto 2 forms of eudaimonic well-being. So on the top here we have other-focused eudaimonic well-being, basically having positive relations with others. On the bottom we have self-focused eudaimonic well-being. So this is probably no surprise to you guys, but the concept of having mastery, a sense of purpose in life, and so on. So what she argued in reviewing the literature is that gratitude and compassion are fundamentally other-oriented. They're felt when we experience positive, they are experienced when we have relations with others. And the argued functions that I mentioned above, so promoting relationship building and reciprocation and alleviating suffering, can be aligned to this broader motivation towards communion. Liz argued that communion should in turn promote other-focused eudaimonic well-being. Due to the self but socially oriented nature of pride, she argued that what pride should do is promote an agency motivation. That is, to have a sense of direct purpose, and that in turn should lead to self-focused eudaimonic well-being. So she's pursued a long line of research testing this model at many different levels. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the data she collected on dispositions to feel these 3 emotions. So that's whether someone has an inclination to experience gratitude, compassion, or pride on a frequent basis, on an intense basis. So I'm going to talk about 2 samples, data from 2 samples. The first is an online sample of US residents, and the second is a slightly smaller sample of Australian community participants. In both studies, participants were asked to indicate their dispositions to experience pride, gratitude, and compassion, as well as contentment. The inclusion of contentment here was to demonstrate that what we're showing with these discrete positive emotions can't simply be attributed to the fact that they're all positive. So the goal of contentment here really is to serve to control for the shared variance with positive valence. Participants also indicated trait levels of motivations in terms of agency and communion. And finally, well-established measures of eudaimonic well-being scored separately into self-oriented and other-oriented forms. So what I'm next going to show you is the results of the modeling to align with the theoretical model I put before. I will say I've deviated from my typical path, which is to put up all of the stats and never say, trust me. But as you'll see when I put up the next slide, putting the statistics on these graphs would have made them largely unintelligible. So I hate to say it, but trust me when I tell you about significant paths and so on. So what I'm going to do, this is the entire model with each of the three focal emotions and contentment, predicting communion and agency, and in turn predicting other-focused and self-focused well-being. I'm going to go through each emotion in turn, first for the first sample and then for the second sample. So what you can see here is partial support for our premise that gratitude should contribute to other-focused well-being. So that is this path here. Interestingly, gratitude also had a direct effect on self-focused well-being. This was unanticipated based on what we know about gratitude. And at least in this sample, there were no effects by motivation. So whatever effect that gratitude is promoting well-being, it's not via these two broad forms of motivation. The second sample data was very similar. I don't know if you guys can see that quite as blue. The blue bars here indicate negative paths.
Lisa, do you turn the lights off?
Y'all can see, if you like, we can see about. Is that better? Better for you guys? Great. So just to be clear here, the bolded lines are significant paths, the orange ones are positive, and the blue are negative. So in our second sample, we actually saw a very similar effect, direct effects of gratitude on both self and other-focused well-being. And in this sample, the anticipated mediation via communion motivation was significant. So it appears to be the case that having the disposition to experience gratitude is beneficial in terms of well-being, perhaps not as cleanly as our theoretical model would have dictated. Turning to compassion, the story becomes a bit more intriguing. So the theoretical model would have argued that compassion should contribute to communion motivation and in turn other-focused well-being. We did find that, but what we also found is this negative direct link from compassion to self-focused eudaimonic well-being. And I'll hold my comment on that until I show you the sample 2 data for compassion, which is here. Once again, we find the anticipated indirect effect on both self and other-focused well-being, but continuing to see this interesting and intriguing negative direct effect.
Can we just pause for a moment? Because
Yes.
It really matters what measures you used.
Yes. So in both of these 2 studies, she used Riff and Key's psychological well-being scales.
And for compassion?
So these 4 scales were drawn from the Dispositional Positive Emotion Scale, which is a trait emotion scale developed by Lonnie Shioda. And the motivation measures were in these 2 studies, from the Personality Research
I
Form.
think what's just going through my mind is, was it really a measure of compassion or was it a measure of empathy?
That's a really good question. So the items in the DPEFs read something like, when I see someone suffering, I have a desire to help them. That could be construed as empathy. And in these 2 studies, we don't have the data to rule out or to disentangle the emotional component of compassion, what you might call affective empathy, from the cognitive acknowledgement that someone is in suffering. But what these scales do assess are the broad tendencies to experience the motivational concomitants of feeling these emotions, at least from the functional view.
Can I ask just, so this is the partial correlation, actually control for communion motivation. What's the simple correlation between compassion and other focus?
The simple correlation is small but positive. And so subsequently in these analyses, we've looked for potential suppression that might be going on because at a raw value, all of our positive emotions are correlated positively in direction with the outcomes we're looking at. There's some evidence of suppression, but difficult to assess. And so that's partly why I would put a bit more weight in the consistent negative effects we're seeing.
But that's really the effect actually of compassion when you control for their communion motivation.
Exactly.
So it's an element of compassion that isn't communion motivation.
Right.
Yet.
So the argument that we are putting forward for this data that we have in this paper, and the second sample is one we're drafting right now, is that insofar as compassion leads to a sense of wanting to help and be with other people, then it can promote other focused well-being. But if it does not, and one could ask, what does that mean? So what does feeling compassion but not being other-oriented mean? That actually can undermine well-being. That's the logic. And there is some similar ideologies there with work that's been done on these two motivations, which is by and large they can be adaptive until they become overblown. So Helgeson discusses unmitigated agency and unmitigated communion, and what we might see here is that unmitigated compassion, that is compassion that doesn't lead to its typical function, which is to help others, may actually be detrimental. An alternate argument is that this is the first study to actually measure these three emotions at the same time, and we've derived the theoretical model based on studies that by and large consider one emotion alone. So here this model is not only accounting for communion motivation, it's also accounting for the robust effects of gratitude that I spoke of a moment ago. And it may be shared kind of common sense of other-orientedness with gratitude that's really driving this effect. I will turn now to the effects on pride, which you can notice here are fairly robust and strong. We had significant total effects, significant indirect effects across the board here. So the anticipated theory that pride would promote agency, motivation, and thereby self-focused well-being played out, but it also did so via communion and also affected via communion, motivation, other focused well-being. So here, again, the theoretical logic that would be drawn on work that solely focuses on pride does appear to hold, but the picture, once you look at other factors, is a little bit more complicated. For thoroughness, here's the data from sample 2, where again we see the direct effect of pride on self-focused well-being, whereby individuals who have a tendency to feel pride in their successes also have a higher sense of mastery and purpose in life, and then that is partially mediated via agency motivation. So I will say that, yes.
What are the correlations with the measures on the left?
Amongst the positive emotions? That's a good question.
A separate factor or not?
I can confidently say from sample 1, and I will hesitantly say from sample 2, the ranges that we saw range from 0.5 to 0.7 or 0.75. So they're certainly positively correlated, and this is a common thing amongst positive emotions. We tested for multicollinearity and didn't find any evidence of it. So despite the fact that we do have shared variance here, it doesn't seem to present a problem for the statistical modeling. Does that answer your question? That's a dangerous question. So?
No, it's all right.
Okay.
I just wanted to know.
Okay. Any other questions on this data? All right. So, what I would say is that the takeaway from that is in line with several other broader research programs that look at positive emotions generally. For instance, work out of Barbara Fredrickson's lab that shows that individuals who experience positive emotions of whatever sort experience higher levels of well-being. What this data suggests is that, at least to some degree, it can matter what type of positive emotion you're feeling, and that it matters in terms of what outcome that is. If anyone's really curious to see the findings for contentment, I have them at the end, and would be happy to discuss those. So now I'd like to move on to the studies that address social well-being. So as I mentioned, that what these studies touch on are things like interpersonal trust, especially amongst strangers, on affiliation amongst strangers, really this idea of the fundamental roots of social dynamics, and also on broader social processes. At least in the case of pride, I'll be discussing relationship dynamics, and in terms of expressed pride, this broader sense of social inclusion. So we'll jump in. This work stemmed from some initial laboratory findings showing that gratitude, in particular, above and beyond general positive emotions, can promote prosocial behavior. So individuals who are feeling grateful towards someone are more likely to help that person and another random person on a tedious task. This work really stems from that, asking whether the effects of gratitude are limited to this kind of reciprocal prosocial behavior, or whether gratitude might have a function that really stands at the basis of social dynamics. So here we looked at trust. So we had participants come into the lab and interact with who they thought was another participant. They completed, this paradigm is from that prior research I mentioned. The individuals complete a tedious task, like 250 trials of lexical decision making. Lo and behold, in the gratitude condition, what happens is that the participant's computer appears to break, and the participant is told that they're going to have to do the 250 trials over again. And the paradigm goes that the confederate, rather than leaving the lab, they've been dismissed, they choose to stay and help the participant fix their computer. And we have, of course, programmed this so that the computer does fix itself. This entire induction is designed to be a social induction of gratitude, right? So put yourself in the shoes of the participant. They've experienced this bad event, and this other person comes in and donates their time and resources to help them get out of it. And this paradigm has been used across 4 or 5 studies and robustly induces gratitude. So we used that paradigm. The DV in this study was a version of a behavioral economics game called the token game. In this game, participants were given 10 tokens. They believed that the person they were playing with also had 10 tokens. And their task was to choose how many tokens that they wanted to send to the other person. If they sent the token to the other person, it would be worth $2 to that other person. And if they kept a token, it would be worth $1. So the sure thing to do is to keep all 10 for yourself. You get $10. But the more trusting thing to do would be to send all 10, I guess, in the hopes that your partner would also send all 10 and you both go home with 20. Now, of course, we don't see dichotomous decision-making in this game. The whole idea is to see whether emotions like gratitude might actually push around decision-making. So, as typical with this paradigm, our participants in the gratitude condition robustly reported higher levels of gratitude than the control. And these are the number of tokens given. So this, of course, ranged, I'm actually going to take this back. I believe, sorry, that this was 4 tokens, not 10. In this study, what we found on average, this darker gray bar on the right here is the gratitude condition, that participants in the gratitude condition, on average, sent more tokens to their partner than kept them for themselves. Some indicator that they're engaging in trusting behavior. But you may say, look, Lisa, that was a really complicated paradigm, and you did assure me that your gratitude participants were feeling grateful, but they were probably feeling a lot of other things. We did a mediation analysis to confirm that the effect of being in the gratitude condition with the computer that broke and then got fixed on how many tokens were given was mediated through felt gratitude, and did find support that it was in particular the emotion that was driving this outcome. Since this data, a number of other adopted a similar take. They've looked at how felt gratitude prompts affiliation with other people, even when it's costly to themselves. And so what this taps into is that gratitude in particular helps individuals rise above self-interest in terms of relational or trusting interest. Now I want to turn the tables a bit, as I said, and focus on gratitude expressions. So often when we want to express gratitude, this takes the form of verbal thanks. It can take lots of other forms, but that's the classic form that we deployed in this study. We had our participants come into the lab, and again, they believed they were interacting with another participant. That participant was a Confederate. The Confederate asked the participant in the waiting area to help them out formatting an assignment on their computer. They couldn't sort out how to do it, and it was due right after the session. And we made the formatting something that all participants would know how to do. Sure enough, they did. And the participant has now provided help to the Confederate. This entire paradigm is meant to set up a situation whereby participants could be thanked. So in half of the cases, the Confederate said, thanks so much, I really appreciate that help you gave me. And in the other half of the cases, what they said is, okay, I guess I better put away my laptop, the experiment's starting soon. And we timed it so that the experimenter would come in right away. So we have manipulated the presence versus absence of an expression of gratitude. And then we had our participants play that same token game I described a moment ago, and also rate the interpersonal warmth of the Confederate. And I want to pause here to explain why we took that measure. So social psychologists commonly talk about two dimensions of person perception. One of them is warmth, basically likability, friendliness, and the other is competence, so how able, intelligent an individual is. Theory would argue that gratitude should really work along the warmth dimension, that it doesn't really speak to competence, but rather this more warmth, likable dimension. So we had hypothesized that the reason why receiving an expression of gratitude might change trusting behavior would be because you perceive that person as more warm. So here are the data. I don't have it up here. Sure enough, participants who received the expression of thanks actually rated the Confederate as being more appreciative. So they did take note of receiving the thanks. Participants who had received thanks rated the Confederate as more warm than the participants who had not. And when we look at the tokens given during the game, what we see here are more tokens given and also more tokens expected. And what this is tapping into is the idea that gratitude is really shaping our perceptions of social dynamics. It's not only shaping how trusting we are of others, it's also shaping how trusting we believe others are. We did a mediation model showing that receiving an expression of gratitude contributed to perceptions of the Confederates' warmth, and that in turn predicted expectations and actual behaviors in the game. So, lending some idea to the fact that gratitude has discrete outcomes, it also has logically consistent mechanisms that exist behind those effects. The third study on gratitude I want to present to you has to do with a more fundamental, maybe more basic process of social affiliation. So trust is certainly important, but before we get to the point of deciding whether to trust someone, we also need to decide whether to interact with them at all. This study was designed to get at that question. Might it be the case that actually receiving an expression of gratitude could shape even that most fundamental decision of, are you a friend or a foe? Should I engage in contact with you or should I not? So we had undergraduate participants come into the lab across 2 sessions. In the first session, they were asked to edit a high school student's admissions essay. This study was run in the US, where admissions essays are quite common. And we sent participants off. They came back 1 week later. We told them that the high school student had received their feedback, and participants then received a note. And the note, supposedly from the high school student, either said, thank you so much, your feedback was really helpful, or I received your feedback and I've made use of it. So very subtle manipulation there. Both notes acknowledged the receipt of help, but only one included this explicit "thank you, I appreciated your contribution" message. In this study, we once again took ratings of warmth as a measure of our hypothesized mechanism, and then we measured first, self-reported intention to affiliate. So if this student came on campus, would you want to take them to coffee? Would you show them where the library is? And then we employed a really subtle behavioral measure. I have to be honest, when we launched this study, I thought if this behavioral measure works, I'm going to be pretty surprised. What we did was we allowed all participants to leave a note for the high school student. And we told them that the admissions office would make sure that the student got the note should they be accepted and come to the university. Nothing more, simply a card and an envelope. If you want to do this, we've already given you your credit for research. If you want to write this note, just put it in the envelope and leave it here in this thing on the door. And what we wanted to code was what participants wrote in that note. There's a social pressure to write a note when you have been given the opportunity to do so, and sure enough, all of our participants wrote a note. But what we coded was whether participants left their contact information in that note as a sign of affiliation, right? So if I have welcomed a new student to campus, I might leave my email address or my phone number so that they can get a hold of me. So really a behavioral proxy for this affiliative intention that we got by a self-report. As before, the manipulation check was successful. Participants who had received the note of thanks rated the high school student as more appreciative. Once again, we find elevated perceptions of warmth upon receiving an expression of gratitude. We also see elevated affiliation intentions. And here we have the percentage of people who left their contact information in the note. So that's 68% versus 41%, statistically significant difference. So, as we may expect, we also modeled the relationships amongst these DVs and found support for the idea that receiving an expression of gratitude leads you to perceive the expressor as more warm and thus have higher intentions to affiliate with them and more likely to actually engage in the type of behavior that would result in that affiliation taking place. So the two indirect effects here were both significant. I'm going to pause there because that was a trio of studies on gratitude to see if you guys have any questions or thoughts on that before we move to pride. No? All good? I hear little murmurs. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, my first work in the area of emotion was on pride, demonstrating that pride contributes to goal perseverance and leadership in interpersonal domains. Since then, I have expanded the purview of what types of processes I look at in terms of how pride might affect it. Some of the work I do with Joseph looks at pride in romantic relationships. You might think this seems like a kind of odd interlude. It turns out that in romantic relationships, there are actually lots of opportunities to feel pride. This isn't not the typical pride that I've been talking about. So it's not pride upon receiving an HD on an exam or getting a paper accepted. The type of pride I'm talking about for this study is actually a sense of pride in one's relationship. So having a sense of pride in one's dynamics with another person. So this has been called group level pride when it happens at the level of a community. This is really the first look to look at relational pride within a romantic context. This is work I've been doing with Rebecca Pincus, who's at the University of Sydney. And in this study, we were interested in capturing a dynamic that could lead to pride and could also lead to negative outcomes. This specific thing is the context of social comparisons. So social comparisons are the dynamics by which we compare our own performance to others. This is typically an elicitor of pride, at least when we outperform someone else. So maybe you got an ARC grant and your office mate didn't. This can elicit pride. In romantic relationships, an interesting process emerges where people actually can take into account the fact that their partner's success might also benefit them. But it is no means to say that this always happens. In this study, we were interested in whether having dispositional pride in one's relationship might actually lead you to feel proud of a partner's outcome, even though it probably means that you were outperformed, which generally feels bad. So we had 290 participants who were in romantic relationships. These varied from dating to married relationships. And they did an online questionnaire in which they were asked about how they frequently compare themselves to their partner. Are those types of comparisons ones that typically they outperform, so they're doing better than their partner, or typically ones where their partner is doing better than them? And also an assessment of how important that domain is. So if you are in a romantic relationship with a non-academic, getting a paper accepted would be very important to you and not as personally important to your partner. So these types of dynamics have been shown to be really important in terms of determining the outcomes of social comparisons. We had a measure of dispositional pride in their relationship. And the key DV we wanted to get at in this study was how do comparisons make individuals feel about themselves, right? So think about where I'm going with this is a situation where partner A has been outperformed by partner B. This can be a negative experience, but for participants who have a sense of pride in their relationship, that might actually contribute to less positive or perhaps, less negative or perhaps positive outcome. So this is the multiple regression we ran. I will highlight two things. One is that we found a robust affective direction. So sure enough, making an upward comparison to your partner generally makes you feel worse about yourself. Likewise, outperforming your partner generally makes you feel good. But over and above that, we found this robust four-way interaction, and I say robust because we've repeated this in different samples, whereby the nature of the direction of the comparison on feelings about the self depend on the domain of importance and dispositional pride. We look at downward comparisons where the partner has outperformed and we see nothing. So what I'm going to present here are the data for upward comparisons only. So these are typically comparisons that make you feel worse about yourself than a downward comparison. But what we find is that for participants who have higher levels of pride in their relationship, they actually are able to benefit, to feel better about themselves, at least in the case where it doesn't matter so much to them, but it does matter to their partner. These specific cases where your partner's successful outcome might actually benefit you in a non-threatening way. What this data suggests is that you only take advantage of that potential benefit if you have a degree of pride in your relationship. So some fairly complicated dynamics here, but the broad takeaway message I would say is that it's not just personal pride that matters, and especially not just personal pride when it comes to romantic relational dynamics. That there are cases that are normally threatening that can become non-threatening and positive insofar as you have this trait disposition. Yes?
Can you distinguish high pride in a relationship from feeling good about the relationship? Or is that the same thing? Like thinking it's a good relationship? Understand what I mean?
I do, in terms of
Sort of
like
evaluation of
relationships.
well with each other or something.
Yeah, so typically that's operationalized as relationship satisfaction.
Yeah.
Or
And it's
relational
not
accord. We see similar patterns, but when we control for relationship satisfaction, we see the same effects. So there appears to be something unique to pride that's driving this type of unique situational benefit. So it's not to say that having a so-called happy relationship isn't a good thing. It certainly is. But at least for this dynamic in particular, it appears to be pride that's playing a particularly good role.
I have to say, you should win an award for the best explanation before we. Oh my God, how she could explain this? I remember you talking about last year, and I understood it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. The study I'd like to to turn to next, again, flips from felt pride, dispositional pride, to pride expressions. And this is literally hot off the presses data. My RA analyzed the data from the second study I'm going to present yesterday. But we're pretty excited about it. The premise of this research is that, as I mentioned before, pride has to do with status. It has to do with status allocation. So if I'm feeling proud of a paper getting accepted, then maybe I will go tell a colleague, and they will see me in a more positive light. So that telling a colleague can take place maybe verbally, but there is research to suggest that pride can also be expressed non-verbally. So this research really turned to the question of pride expressions and status allocation, but a more nuanced social psychological take on that, which is we don't just allocate status, we actually create group boundaries. Now, one way to look at it is that someone expressing pride can be a threat to you, right? Your colleague gets a paper in science, that might be a threat to you. But to some degree, at least if they're part of your group, you might benefit from that positive outcome. We're back to a similar logic that I was talking about with the romantic relationships. So to get at the question of whether expressions of pride might shape, to what degree do you pull someone who's proud into your in-group, we compared how such expressions affect two social dynamics. One is a very face valid, to what degree is this person part of your group, and a second, more subtle manipulation, or subtle measure, which is perceived identity overlap. So to what degree are you similar with this person? Now, we've run two studies on this. The first compared two types of pride displays. So it has been argued that there is basically good pride and bad pride. Authentic pride is thought to be the functional positive emotion that I've been discussing so far. Jessica Tracy, amongst others, has argued that there is also a less functional, more negative type of pride. She labels that hubristic pride. And it turns out there are nonverbal expressions that are associated with that. So in the first study, we had participants watch a very short video of someone, and in the authentic pride condition, it was just the head up. Didn't plan on enacting this display for you, so we'll see how I can do. The authentic pride expression went something like, right, slight smile, head tilt. The hubristic pride expression, again, shoulders up, and it had this kind of head to the side, still cocked up, and then a gaze to the left at the end. We didn't develop these expressions. It was developed by Nicole Nelson, who's now at UQ. And participants robustly differentiate between these. They call both of them pride, but one of them is good pride and the other is bad. In the second study, we wanted to turn towards the more static expressions of pride, which basically look like this. And to differentiate authentic and hubristic pride in that type of research, what you do is you accompany it with some sort of explanation of why the person had the success. So in the authentic pride condition, you see that same expression, and someone says, I did well because I worked hard. In the authentic pride condition, they saw similar expression saying, I did well because I'm simply talented. Okay? Success, still pride, just different forms of it. So at the end of the day, what we're asking about in this study is how these types of expressions might affect group inclusivity, right? Do you want this person in your social group or not? So these are the results from the dynamic expressions, whereby participants who saw that authentic dynamic expression perceived that person as more a part of their group at a marginal level and had more identity overlap with that person at a significant level. Now, a good question to ask might be, is it authentic pride driving it up or hubristic pride driving it down? My guess before I analyzed the data yesterday with my RA was that it was hubristic pride driving it down. But it turns out, when we ran the static expression study, which had the neutral, it appears to be the case that authentic pride is actually the positive driver in this case. That we actually specifically are more inclusive of individuals who display authentic pride following a success versus hubristic pride or a neutral expression following a success. So that authentic pride when it's displayed as such, or perceived as such, I should say, is actually this signal that we should engage in group inclusivity. You could call this affiliation, but we don't have any behavioral measures in this study.
What is hubristic pride? Is it what? How do you define it?
Like vanity or?
Is it just arrogance?
So, this is a great question. And I have to say, I have been an authentic hubristic skeptic all along. I'm not fully convinced that hubristic pride is an emotion. The terms used to assess it are arrogance, conceited, stuck-up, snobbish.
Okay.
But the way you try to express it, it looks more like arrogance to me. It's like looking down on the other person.
I agree. Jessica Tracy, who's been the major proponent of authentic and hubristic differentiations of pride, has argued that there are both forms of emotion that you can distinguish from narcissism, that you can distinguish from overconfidence, that it is actually an emotional trait or an emotional state. As I said, I've yet to be convinced that it is an emotion that can be felt and expressed specifically, but I do put a lot of weight in the fact that people will read into a pride display as to whether it is towards this warranted, merited side of things or an overblown, arrogant claiming of success. And I should note here that in both of these studies, the two pride displays were seen as equivalently proud.
What do you think the different function is? Is it, I don't want to get too far straight, but is there a purpose for both types of display?
Jessica Tracy would argue that authentic pride, and this is the study we're running tomorrow, when I can get it launched online, is to get at what's the mechanism at play here. She has argued that all pride has to do with status, but just like there are two types of pride, there are also two types of status. So prestige is earned status by merit. She argues that authentic pride aligns with prestige. There's also dominance-based prestige, which is status that is taken via threat or coercion or overpowerment, and she argues that the alignment is there with hubristic pride. So she argues that from an evolutionary standpoint that there is a role for both types of status, maybe time and place. Over the long term, it's probably better to have prestige-based status than dominance-based status. Okay. I do want to move on to the two studies that have looked at this kind of psychosocial benefit at the community level. The first is very brief. It's ongoing work with my PhD student, Andrew Wauk, and the last is research I've been doing with the Blood Service. So, a lot of research has shown that part of the reason why people volunteer their time, their resources, and their money is that they derive a sense of positive emotion from that. Positive affect, positive mood. Until now, no one has taken a very differentiated view on that. So is it that, going back to this idea of varieties of positive emotion, is it the case that volunteers report these types of emotions equivalently or perhaps differentially? So this is very initial data on this question. Of course, my own inclination would be that there is something to the idea of differentiating between these emotions. We had 125 participants who had said in a pre-screening that they had volunteered in the past. Think about the last time that they volunteered and then report the degree to which they felt a number of positive emotions. This is from an adapted version of the Modified Differential Emotion Scale, which gets at a number of positive emotions. I'll show you in a second. 6 of these emotions are socially oriented. So we're actually going beyond the pride, compassion, gratitude, trifecta I've been talking about before to kind of cast the net a bit more broadly. So this, again, is very initial analyses. And the takeaway from this graph, up here we have intercorrelations amongst the positive emotions. Kind of going back to your question earlier, we get robust positive correlations amongst positive emotions. What I've done here is highlight the socially oriented ones in orange. Their overlap is in a slightly darker shade of orange. And what we see is that the socially oriented positive emotions do appear to hang together. It's not clear that they hang together any more so than they do with other positive emotions. So we do get what we're calling a bit of groupiness of positive emotion. But on the bottom here, what you have are the mean levels of positive emotions reported by these participants upon their last experience. And these aren't gigantic differences, but what we are seeing is variations of different emotions. So in particular, gratitude, happiness, and a sense of feeling appreciated. And where we're going with this research is to look at whether volunteers, if they are deriving these discrete emotions, that might contribute differentially towards the intention and actual engagement in volunteering in the future. Okay. I'm going to hop along to the blood donation research because in some ways this is the coolest because we have actual engagement in behavior. This is work I've been doing with the Australian Red Cross Blood Service. In collaboration with them, we were able to recruit 800 donors as they sat in the refreshment area just following a whole blood donation. And in this area, we had them complete a survey indicating their current emotional state, including pride, and as well as constructs from the theory of planned behavior. This may seem like a rather odd entrance to the talk at this point. What I will say is that in the blood donation literature, which is quite robust, the theory of planned behavior is by far the most dominant theoretical approach. So in order to situate ourselves in the key players of determining whether someone's going to come back, we measured these classic constructs, including attitude towards the behavior, perceived control over doing the behavior again, self-efficacy over doing the behavior, and norms about whether people you know also do the behavior. And as well as intention to do the behavior. And collaboration with the blood service means that we were able to extract in the following 6 months whether these donors actually came back or not. And this is particularly important because the link between intending to do a prosocial behavior and actually doing it can be less strong than we'd like in research. So this is the starting model that I used on this data, which is so this portion of the model with the TPP constructs predicting intention to return is the very classic simplified approach of TPP. I started with the model just asking how does pride contribute to that, either via intention or directly to return. The model fit wasn't great, so I engaged in model modification based on modification indices iteratively until fit happened, and basically this is the model that I ended up with. The negative bar here, the blue bar here on the top is negative. So this is super intriguing finding, to me at least. So donors who feel proud in the waiting area, in the refreshment area, just following their donation, are actually less likely to come back unless they have a more positive attitude towards the behavior, a positive sense of self-efficacy, and more positive norms. Those things in turn contribute to a higher intention to come back that robustly does predict whether they come back. And we have data coming in right now as part of the linkage project that I have with them, where we've now actually tracked donors from the waiting area into the chair, both pre and post needle insertion, to the refreshment area to see how these emotional trajectories change over time. A very good question you might ask here is whether the same thing holds for positive emotion, and due to time I'll say it's a bit complicated. We see much higher multicollinearity in this study, whereby donors who are reporting high levels of pride also robustly endorse that they're feeling happy and positive and content at the same time. So we're working through the modeling of that at the moment. Yes?
This pride, is it authentic or is it kind of like the arrogance kind of pride?
That's a good question. So in this study, we didn't differentiate between authentic and hubristic pride. So literally the items here are how proud, confident, and fulfilled are you? And these are items that have been used in the majority of studies looking at pride that isn't differentiated between the good type and the bad type. Okay, so just to wrap up, hopefully what I have shown you today is an amalgamation of research that demonstrates that whether felt or expressed, differentiated positive emotions can actually have outcomes for well-being broadly construed, right? At the personal level, at the interpersonal level in terms of social dynamics, as well as at the community level in terms of promoting prosocial behavior like volunteering and blood donation. So I will thank my collaborators at UNSW as well as universities around the world, and in particular the generous contributions of the Blood Service before opening it up for any questions.